Imagine this. 20 countries. One currency. No exit door. In 1999, they sold this dream to 340 million people with fireworks and champagne. A united Europe, an economic superpower that would rival America. They never told you the terrifying truth. The men who designed the euro already knew before the first coin was minted that this project was mathematically guaranteed to tear Europe apart. Not someday, not maybe, but inevitably. And the fuse is still burning. This isn't conspiracy or hindsight. The warnings were written in cold academic papers decades before the launch. In 1961, a Canadian economist named Robert Mundell published a paper so dense, most economists nearly fell asleep reading it. Yet, it contained the single most important prediction about the euro. 38 years before it even existed, Mundell called it the theory of optimal currency areas. His question was brutally simple. Under what conditions can different countries safely share one currency without the union eventually fracturing? His answer became a checklist of 4 non-negotiable conditions. All 4 had to be met, or the union would crack under asymmetric shocks. Crises that devastate one country while leaving another almost untouched. The 4 conditions. Labor must move freely across borders. Capital must flow where it's needed. Wages and prices must be flexible enough to adjust quickly. And most critically, there must be a central fiscal authority, a shared treasury that automatically transfers money from rich regions to struggling ones, cushioning the blow when disaster strikes. Think of the United States. When a hurricane destroys communities in Mississippi or a recession hits Michigan, federal taxes, FEMA disaster funds, and nationwide unemployment insurance flow automatically from Washington to the affected areas. Families receive support, states rebuild, and the dollar survives. Because America is a true fiscal union with powerful built-in stabilizers that spread risk across the entire country. Europe met none of Mundell's 4 conditions, and the architects knew it from the very beginning. Labor, mobility. Europeans don't uproot their lives and move the way Americans do between states. Language barriers, deep cultural attachments, strong family ties, and rigid housing regulations make cross-border relocation almost impossible for ordinary workers. When Spanish unemployment hit a devastating 27% in 2009, desperate workers didn't flood into Germany seeking jobs. They simply couldn't, practically, psychologically, or linguistically. Families stayed behind, trapped in regions with no opportunities. Wage flexibility, even more unrealistic. Try forcing powerful German or French unions to accept 20% pay cuts to restore competitiveness. The political system would collapse under the weight of protests and strikes long before wages ever fell significantly. Labor markets across Europe are rigid, protected by strong social contracts that resist rapid downward adjustment. And the central fiscal authority. The Maastricht Treaty of 1992 explicitly banned it. No European treasury, no shared unemployment insurance, no automatic transfers from surplus countries to deficit ones. They built a full currency union without a fiscal union, a magnificent house constructed with no foundations whatsoever, doomed to sway dangerously in the first strong economic wind. Milton Friedman, one of the most influential economists of the 20th century, warned in 1997, 2 years before launch, that the euro would increase political tensions rather than reduce them. He predicted that the one-size-fits-all monetary policy would devastate weaker economies during the next recession, while barely affecting stronger ones, eventually fracturing the European project itself with resentment and nationalism. He was ridiculed by euro enthusiasts at the time. The mechanical trap snapped shut almost immediately after the currency launched. Before the euro, countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland paid high interest rates on their government bonds, often 10 to 12% or more, because markets accurately priced their real economic risks, lower productivity, and weaker institutions. Those expensive borrowing costs forced a degree of fiscal discipline on governments. Overspending carried a heavy price. The moment they joined the Eurozone, everything changed dramatically. Markets assumed these nations were now implicitly backed by Germany's economic powerhouse. Interest rates for Greece, Spain, Ireland, and Portugal crashed almost overnight to near German levels, around 3 to 4%. It felt like practically free money flooding in from every direction. They borrowed like never before. Greece used the cheap credit to fund an oversized public sector and promised generous pensions at 58% of final salary. Spain and Ireland ignited the biggest real estate bubbles in European history. Between 2000 and 2008, Spain alone built more new homes than Germany, France, and the UK combined, not because of genuine housing needs, but because abundant cheap credit made speculative returns look irresistibly safe and profitable. In a normal country with its own sovereign currency, dangerous imbalances eventually correct themselves through devaluation. The currency weakens on international markets, exports become cheaper and more competitive, tourism revives, and the economy slowly regains balance. The process is painful and involves real hardship, but it is possible and self-correcting over time. Inside the Eurozone, however, that vital escape valve was removed forever. Countries could no longer devalue their way back to competitiveness. The only remaining mechanism was brutal internal devaluation, crushing wages, slashing public spending, and enduring years or even decades of deep economic pain, just to regain ground against highly productive Germany. Unit labor costs in the South rose 20 to 30% relative to stable Germany during the boom years. The competitiveness and productivity gap widened relentlessly every single year the euro existed. Southern Europe financed this growing imbalance by borrowing ever larger sums, mostly from banks in Germany and France that were eager to recycle the North's huge trade surpluses. Then 2008 hit with full force. Greece's hidden deficit exploded from a reported 3.7% of GDP to a real 12.7%. Bond yields soared past 35%. Then higher. Default became a mathematical certainty rather than a distant risk. The Troika, the European Union, European Central Bank, and IMF arrived with rescue packages, but the price was the harshest austerity program in peacetime history. Public sector wages cut by 30%, pensions slashed dramatically, VAT taxes raised sharply, and healthcare spending gutted to the bone. Greece's economy contracted by a devastating 26% between 2008 and 2013, a collapse as deep as America's entire Great Depression from 1929 to 1933, but compressed into just 5 brutal years. Youth unemployment reached 60%. Suicide rates jumped 35%. Hospitals ran out of basic medicines and even insulin. Pharmacies turned away patients. Birth rates collapsed as young couples decided they could no longer afford to start families in such uncertainty. Entire towns emptied of working-age people. The human cost was heartbreaking and visible on the streets. Pensioners rummaging through trash for food, young graduates emigrating in despair, and communities losing hope. Even the IMF later admitted in its own 2013 internal review that the program had been too harsh. Their fiscal multiplier assumptions were badly wrong. Every euro cut in government spending destroyed far more economic output than the models had predicted. Austerity amplified the downturn instead of stabilizing it. Yet Greece had no choice. Without its own currency to devalue, without independent monetary tools, and without meaningful European fiscal transfers to cushion the blow, painful internal devaluation through endless austerity was the only option left, like being told to crawl 4 miles on a badly broken leg, until the bone somehow healed itself through sheer endurance and time. By 2015, after all the suffering and sacrifice, Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio was actually higher than in 2009. The harsh medicine had made the patient significantly weaker. When you deliberately destroy economic output to repay debts, the denominator shrinks faster than the numerator can be reduced. The single interest rate set in Frankfurt made everything worse. In 2003, Germany needed low rates to support its painful structural reforms after years of stagnation. At the same time, Spain and Ireland were experiencing dangerous debt-fueled booms and needed higher rates to cool their overheating property bubbles. The ECB could deliver only one compromise rate. Too loose for the South, pouring gasoline on the flames, and only marginally helpful for the North. In 2011, the situation reversed dramatically. Spain was collapsing with unemployment heading toward 25%, and desperately needed loose monetary policy, stimulus, and lower borrowing costs. But Germany faced rising inflation pressures and preferred tighter policy. The ECB still raised interest rates twice, because its only legal mandate was strict price stability below 2%, with no responsibility for jobs, growth, or financial stability. Spain and Greece, already in cardiac arrest, were hit with even higher borrowing costs at the worst possible moment. Mario Draghi's famous "whatever it takes" declaration in 2012 saved the euro from immediate death and breakup. But it was also a public confession. The original design had fundamentally failed. The ECB was forced to improvise massive emergency interventions because the architects had forgotten or deliberately omitted to build any proper fire extinguisher or safety net into the system. Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz later called it half a surgery. They opened the chest cavity, performed only part of the necessary operation, then declared success and walked away, leaving the patient dangerously exposed and unfinished on the operating table. Germany, meanwhile, gained exactly what it wanted. A permanently undervalued currency, tailored for its powerful export machine of cars, machinery, and chemicals. Huge trade surpluses were generated and recycled as loans to the southern periphery. When those loans inevitably went bad during the crisis, the subsequent bailout programs protected northern banks far more effectively than they ever truly rescued ordinary southern citizens, who bore the brunt through wage cuts and reduced services. The 2010 to 2015 crisis was never truly solved, only postponed with trillions in ECB money printing, massive bond-buying programs, and increasingly creative new tools that let Frankfurt suppress bond yields indefinitely and prevent markets from delivering their honest verdict on southern debt sustainability. Today in 2026, the contradictions remain unresolved. Italy's debt-to-GDP ratio sits at roughly 138% and continues to edge higher. France's public debt is approaching 118%. Southern growth remains relatively stagnant compared to what was promised, with the Eurozone overall showing only modest expansion, around 1.1 to 1.3%. The bicycle Jacques Delors once described keeps losing speed, held upright only by ever larger central bank interventions and emergency policy patches. They sold you unity and shared prosperity. What they actually built was a cage, too expensive to leave, too fragile to last without constant emergency repairs, and too politically toxic to honestly fix or reform. The greatest mistake wasn't launching the euro itself. Ambitious projects sometimes fail, that is the nature of grand human endeavors. The real tragedy was the stubborn refusal to admit failure when the overwhelming evidence arrived, and then doubling down by punishing the patients for the disease the system itself had created. The next time someone tells you that a monetary union can work without a fiscal union, without a shared treasury capable of real transfers, and without genuine risk-sharing, remember Greece. Remember the empty hospitals and pharmacies with no medicine. Remember the wheelbarrows of unemployment statistics and the lost generation of young Europeans denied a fair start in life. Remember the families who stopped having children because hope had vanished, because the warnings were there in 1961. The architects read Mendel's paper. They understood the cold mathematics perfectly. They chose to build it anyway, and the fuse is still burning.